This is Marty with Marty's Diesel, and tonight's video is going to cover why our fuel pressure gauges will read not zero either during the install when you're trying to set it or after the install when you've already set it to 60 and then it crept up on its own. Let me address the first one first. When you're doing an initial installation, if you have the threads on the regulator set to 6 threads outside of the nut, your fuel pressure should be around 50 or 60 psi if you follow that direction. If the fuel pressure goes well above that 60, 70, 80, 90 and you have the regulator, the stud sticking out above the nut like I tell you to, then that typically means that the return side is pinched, and the most common place for the return side to be pinched would be behind the AC bracket. Now remember, this is on initial install. This means that your feed and return, your blue quick disconnect, your green quick disconnect, those are both in a 5-gallon bucket of fuel, right? Now, let's say that this is not during the install, okay? And this means that you've already driven the truck down the road, it's already been hooked up to the selector valve, and you've monitored your vacuum. If the fuel pressure gauge gets stuck at 60 plus, like 70, 80, 90, 100, or even, maybe it's pegged, it's all the way around onto the back side of the, the little set pin that's inside the gauge. The only reason that occurs is because the fuel pressure gauge experienced an overpressurization. And this is going to be from when you're driving the truck. Your selector valve, let's say you're on the front tank. It's pulling fuel from the front tank. It's returning fuel to the front tank. You hit the button to where it goes to the rear tank. If you have debris on the inlet side, not the return side, the inlet side may not switch, or maybe it will partially switch, and then the return side will switch. And when it switches, you're going to overfill one of the tanks. And as you overfill that tank, it's going to get max filled inside that tank, and even just a little bit of restriction is going to cause your fuel pressure to skyrocket. And it only takes seconds for this to happen. And when this happens, it can break the gauge and it can break the fuel pump. I just got off the phone with a customer not 15 minutes ago who had a Bosch, who had this problem. He's got to buy a new fuel pump because he's had this problem. I walked him through all the steps, put another Bosch pump on, ran it out of a bucket. Everything was good. He hooked it up to a selector valve. He found out that he had extremely high vacuum on one tank and not the other. He also found out that he was returning fuel from one tank to the other. No good, okay? That's the only reason that these gauges are not reading zero, either during the initial install, if you didn't drop it, right? The initial install, if it's pinched behind the AC bracket when you're setting up the gauge. That's the first way. The second way that this happens is after everything's installed and everything was perfect during your install, is that over time, debris gets caught in the selector valve. Maybe you notice it right away, maybe you don't. But the correction for this is to clean out the selector valve, and then you're either going to have to make a decision on using a pre-pump solutions kit to where you can maintain both fuel tanks, a selector valve delete kit, which is a little bit harder to install, but it allows you to bypass the selector valve on the fuel side, or you're going to need to go to a single tank conversion. More than likely, you're going to have to choose one of those options in order to fix your problem. The symptom is going to be broken gauges, the gauges that don't read zero, and it's going to be fuel pumps that die. I don't care what fuel pump you have. I don't care what fuel pressure gauge you put on there. If you experience 130, 140, 150, 160 psi on either one of those two components, they're going to fail. I've been selling these regulators that are on this particular kit and or an Airmotive version of it for 15 plus years. Not once in 15 plus years have I ever experienced a regulator cause this pressure to spike. It's never the regulator. Unless somebody was messing around with the set screw on the top, the adjustment, the pressure adjustment. If you were doing that, then that's on you, that's your fault, whatever. But if you follow directions and you have 6 threads sticking out of the top of that stud there on top of the nut on that regulator, you will never have the regulator be the cause or the reason why your fuel pressure is above 60 or 70 psi. I made this video today because I feel like I say this 3 or 4 times a week. We sell a shit ton of pre-pump style kits, pre-pump solutions, single tank conversions, selector valve deletes for this specific problem. All I ask is that if you experience this problem, you address the problem. You don't just keep putting fuel pumps and fuel gauges on it, because that's only correcting the symptom. You know how I am here at Marty's Diesel. I don't like to just deal with and replace parts for symptoms. I like to repair problems. Understand that relationship. It's super important. Fix the problem and the symptom will go away. That's all for today.